Welcome to the Election University podcast, a weekly show where we hear from industry experts who share tips and tricks for winning campaigns. Whether you're running for office now, thinking about it for the future, or just want to know more about campaigns and elections, Election University is for you. With Election University, click, learn, win. And now your hosts, Jason Bennett and Rainey Cohen.
Hello.
Hello.
How's everyone doing today? Thanks for joining us for another episode. Oh, how are you doing, Rainey?
Well, I'm doing great. I think you just keep asking the audience who can't answer you back. And I think it's funny every time. I'm wonderful. How are you, Jason?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for asking.
Excellent.
And thank you to our audience for joining us for another episode of Election University Podcast. I am your host, Jason Bennett.
And I'm Rainey Cohen.
We're very excited, obviously, for today's guest. This is a topic that we have been soft pitching to, some our listeners and some of our cohort. And we think it's going to be a bit of a hit I don't want to jinx it, but if you will, it might be a hit. We're going to be talking about politics for introverts today and how to have better conversations in politics. So we're going to be talking with a woman who has given several TED Talks. Her video, How to Have Better Conversation, has been viewed by more than 10 million viewers. Mm-hmm. And so it's been rated, one of the number one TED Talks by Glassdoor and on CNBC. It's quite popular. It's a very good episode. So we're going to talk to her today, and she's going to give us some advice on how to, have better conversation.
And she's kind of famous, y'all. This is Celeste Headlee, who I know from my time working at NPR from The Takeaway. She now hosts a different radio show, but I'm a little starry-eyed.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm excited to talk to her. So it's always fun to talk to fellow radio folk.
You're going to stay in the moment in the interview, right?
I'm going to stay in the moment. That is one of her biggest pieces of advice. So I can't fail in front of her. The pressure is on.
Yeah, it is. Celeste Headlee is a public radio host and has been the host and correspondent for NPR and Public Radio International since 2006. She is the author of We Need to Talk, How to Have Conversations That Matter, which is published by Harper Wave, a practical guide to the lost art of conversation.
Celeste's TEDx talk sharing 10 ways to have a better conversation was listed as one of the most watched TED Talks in 2016 by CNBC and named the number one must-watch TED Talk by Glassdoor with over 12 million total views to date.
Oh, wow.
Including one by me earlier today.
Yeah, it's fantastic. So I'm very excited about today's episode. I think we're going to learn quite a bit. Fun fact about Jason Bennett, I am actually an introvert.
Shut up. Hosting a podcast as an introvert.
I know. If you could see Rainey's face right now, it's quite comical. Yeah, I actually don't derive a lot of energy from social interaction. It drains me quite a bit. And I'm kind of wicked out after I have to go, to a political function. I am complete mush afterwards. Yeah. So I think it's... the way it's been defined is about how you derive your energy. Or
right. Do you feed off the energy of other people and being boisterous and loud and out there, or does that activity actually drain you?
Yeah.
My wife is also an introvert, Diane. Yeah. Learning how to date Diane was hard for me because I didn't understand what introverts go through. And then I kind of realized that I also get drained by conversations, especially in political circles. And so even I, who thought of myself as an extrovert, have to figure out how I kind of refuel and show up when I need to work a room or, do things like that. So
exactly.
Celeste has some stuff to tell us about it.
Yeah. She'll give us some advice on how to maybe recharge and kind of sustain good conversation when everything in our body is like, no, don't. Stop.
I'm going to bed.
Your brain is leaking out of your ears right now. Please go away. So without further ado, let's get right into this interview. Celeste, Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure.
So before we get started, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your background and your new book and how you came to do this particular work.
I didn't start out as a journalism major, right? I didn't train that way in college. My degrees are both in voice. I'm a professional opera singer. So when I became a full-time professional journalist, I kind of had to get that training on the back end. And one of the things I really wanted to learn to do was do a really great interview. I wanted to improve my interviewing skills. And so I started reading everything that I could read about essentially how to have a good conversation, because that's what an interview is, right? The best interview sounds like a great conversation. The problem was the information I was reading was terrible. When I went to try it out in the studio, it didn't work. All those things about nodding your head and maintaining eye contact and saying and summarizing what you just heard, none of that worked. In fact, oftentimes it made conversations worse. So I had to start from scratch. And what I discovered was that the things that made for a better interview ended up being the very things that worked just as well at home, talking to my kid, or in the office, talking to my boss. And that's when I started to sort of realize that there is sort of a basic good conversation in pretty much any situation. And that's where that all began, was just sort of finding out these are the fundamentals of a really good conversation.
And so the question that I have then is, if you're doing the uh-huhs and the head nods and the basics that I think we've all been taught, right? The affirmative body language and nonverbal cues.
Yeah, it's terrible.
What is that resulting in? Robotic conversation, very surface conversation? What do you think is making it a bad interview specifically?
I think the worst thing that it does is it further disengages you. So here's the problem. Human beings just in general are not great at listening. I mean, we think that's because of technology. It's not. The research going back to even the 1950s and 40s shows that just as a species, it requires effort for us to really listen well. And even then, we're just not great listeners. So already we have this difficulty, right, in paying attention. So when you're learning all these things about, okay, now I need to maintain eye contact and I need to say every so often and all of those things, you're further distracting yourself. I mean, you're literally learning how to pretend you're paying attention, which occupies your thoughts, instead of simply paying attention.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, so in this process, I'm wondering if you discovered, are you an introvert or an extrovert or some kind of hybrid of the two? And how does that play into how you can have a conversation?
So I am probably a classic introvert. I mean, I'm just going by the psychological definition of somebody who gets their energy when they're alone, right? Has your best ideas when you're alone, and someone who requires a certain amount of time alone in order to not lose their mind.
Right.
Right. So that is absolutely me. But it's quite interesting. Many people have the mistaken idea that introverts are not good in conversation. Introversion is not the same as social awkwardness. They're not the same thing. You may not enjoy a lot of conversation. You may not enjoy crowds, but that doesn't mean you're bad at it. And I think even more provocatively, recent research, and I mean over the past 10 years, has shown that small talk is really good for you. And I mean that quite literally. It can make you live longer. It can reduce your chances of getting depression. It can reduce your chances of having a cardiac event. Small talk, those little chats you have with your Uber driver that you avoid by staring at your phone the whole time and not making eye contact, those conversations are actually very good for you, both emotionally and physically. So I would never want someone to say, well, I'm an introvert, so I'm not going to talk to my barista. Not a good idea. Go ahead and have that conversation about the weather.
Well, so I think that speaks to some of the problems that we have in politics, right? Where we've been socialized to not talk about, that it's not polite to talk about politics. And yet in this business, working a room and having small conversations is exactly what you need to do in order to get ahead. So do you have any advice on how you talk politics with strangers? How do you even start those small conversations with people you don't know?
Yeah, so think about this for a second. Our strategy, literally for generations, I mean, it's been so constant a strategy that, they were making jokes about it when George Bernard Shaw wrote Pygmalion, My Fair Lady, right? I mean, only talk about the weather and your health. Mm-hmm. But is this really working? Is it working? Or is it actually making things worse? for us to avoid those conversations. I mean, the fact of the matter is that now that we really are trying to avoid those topics entirely, now that you go to Christmas dinner and you're like, okay, I'm not going to bring up Trump, then we're just not learning anything about any politics except our own.
Right.
And that's a problem. We're not educated on politics or religion anymore because we won't talk about politics and religion. So a better strategy is simply to have those conversations without getting into an argument. And I know that you're sitting there going, well, that's easier said than done. No, it's actually pretty simple. And I will tell you exactly how to do that. Here's how you do it. Stop trying to change anybody's mind. Just stop.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Number one, you're not going to do it. It's not going to happen, right? I mean, when was the last conversation you had about politics where you disagreed and the other person ended by going, oh my gosh, you're right about everything. I'm totally convinced.
1986.
Yeah.
I think that was the last time that happened for me.
Right. So forget it. It's frustrating you. That's part of the reason that people get into arguments is because they're both frustrated because they're not achieving their goal of changing somebody else's mind. Not going to happen. Let it go. Instead, go into those conversations expecting to learn something from the other person. And you can always do that. You can do it 100% of the time. And that way, your conversations about politics not only will educate you, you will not only come out of them smarter than you went in, but number two, both people will probably have a good experience and be more likely to talk about it again. And that's what we want, is more people talking about it.
Given that politics is transactional by nature, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to tell you how I'm going to vote on a particular issue that you care about. You then vote for me at the ballot box or whatever. And you know, I'm curious to know what you would think a definition of a good conversation is in politics when maybe one person has power and the other person doesn't, or this, you know, very foundational transactional nature of politics. Can you have good conversation when the power players that are in this it's imbalanced? Can that happen?
Yeah, you absolutely can. And, you know, as a journalist, I have to have these conversations all the time. You know, I will have a conversation with an anti-vaxxer, for example. I'm never going to ask them for their medical opinion on vaccinations. If I do that, if I need that, I will go to the head of the CDC, right? But I can at least get a better understanding of where they're coming from. Even transactional, and let me talk about like one of the most difficult transactions ever. And I use this guy's story as an example all the time. There's a jazz musician, a black guy named Daryl Davis. PBS did a documentary on him called Accidental Courtesy. And in his off time, he convinces guys to leave the KKK. Again, I emphasize he's a black dude. Mm-hmm. And he's so successful at it that he almost personally dismantled the KKK operation in the state of Maryland. And when you ask him, what did you say? What did you say to convince them? Right? I mean, if we're talking about a high standard for trying to convince somebody, that's as high as it gets.
Right.
He says, I didn't say anything. I just listened to them. In fact, I said to them, you convince me that you're right. Make your case. Convince me. And what he says is, by passively listening to them, by actively listening to them, I am passively teaching them about myself.
Wow.
Powerful.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm just trying, because that's a lot of information to take in when you're thinking about this from politics, right? And as people are thinking about having to work rooms and build relationships, because, you know, another part of this foundation is relationship building. And
yes,
and going around and trying to, you know, it's almost like collecting likes on Facebook, right? It's a bit of a popularity contest. It's hard to have meaningful conversations or conversations that matter, if you will. And so are we doing it wrong? I guess, you know, is the methodology not even just about trying to change people's minds about issues, but the way we're going about this relationship building part of this, is that flawed as well? And if so, what should we do to change it?
So you can use our own human foibles to your advantage. So one of the things that sort of broke open my understanding of communication was a study that came out of Harvard in 2014. And they found that talking about yourself, what scientists refer to as self-disclosure, activates the same part of the brain as sex and heroin. It's inherently pleasurable to talk about yourself and the things you like. So if you flip this on its head, if you're trying to make someone feel good, let them talk about themselves. Here's another bit of scientific research that might help you as well. They have discovered that when somebody feels good about something they've done, when they feel pleased with themselves, they're way more likely to be open-minded and open to change. So let's say you're trying to convince someone. One of the best things to do when you need to make an argument or disagree with somebody is first let them tell you about something they're proud of. Let them tell you about their kids. Let them tell you about the best thing they accomplished in the past month. And then you can move on to whatever it is you're trying to convince them, because science tells us the brain is more open to being convinced of something after it feels that sense of self-pleasure, that sense of accomplishment and pleasure.
So based on this, your explanation just now, I feel like I know the answer to this question, but I want to ask it anyway, because I remember my very first networking event when I showed up alone and I didn't know anyone and I was terrified. No one had taught me how to work a room. I'd never shown up to a room of strangers before and needed to make a professional good impression. If you had had the opportunity to give me advice before I went to that event, what would you say?
I would say let other people talk and ask good questions. Show true curiosity in other people. That's what I would say.
Yeah.
Beyond just asking about their job and things.
Yeah, not just that. You should never you can't go with pre-prepared questions. Right? Because they're not authentic. And if there's one thing we all pick up on immediately, and it's when someone's pretending to pay attention to us. Right? When they're like, oh, that's interesting. Wow. Yeah.
Oh, that's the worst. And you always know when someone's doing that to you. So why do we continue to do that?
Yeah.
So why do we do it?
Right.
Because it's easy. It's the least effort that I have to exert at an event, right? If I'm going there and I'm already tired from the workday, or I'm not looking forward to going to this particular event, I'll just default to my easy comfort zone, right? Which is the 3 lame questions that I ask at every event.
We kind of just resign ourselves to we need to schmooze this room and
check a box.
Show up there, have a drink, ask people about their day, and then ghost.
Yeah.
We've done nothing meaningful with our time if we do that.
I mean, we're introverts.
You can turn it into a game. Yeah, you can turn it into a game, though, which is what I've ended up doing. So what I've discovered is that everybody is an expert in something that's interesting. Everybody knows something that pretty much nobody else does, right?
Right.
And so if your goal is to figure out what that is, there was a congressman who ended up being an expert in Wagner, right? That was interesting. That was interesting. And there's nothing more fun for me than hearing a scientist rant about some completely random, obscure thing that they're completely passionate about. And then even if you're tired, you don't even have to participate anymore. If you can find that thing that somebody is passionate about, you can shut up and just bathe in whatever it is that they're passionate about. It actually becomes enjoyable. It's
learn
way
something.
Better than Netflix. Yeah.
Yeah.
And they'll remember you because you made them feel good.
Yeah. I'm going back to Rainey's question a little bit. She's a little terrified going into this. Does rehearsal, does practice, doing many of these events over and over, does that help the situation at all?
Only if you're actually, keeping at it. So the best practice, especially for an introvert, the best practice is to start having those tiny little conversations with people who are paid to be nice to you. So, I'm not kidding. So,
makes sense.
Okay, so for example, the conversations with your cashier at the grocery store, it has so much to benefit you. First of all, it's time limited. So there's no need for an introvert to be afraid. it's not going to be a 2-hour conversation. It's 90 seconds, right? And you know that. And then you have to leave the store. So 0 risk. And number 2, they are literally paid to be nice to you. So in terms of like trying stuff out, try it with your barista first. Try it with your grocery store cashier first. Try it in the waiting line at the doctor's office or whatever it may be, although that can sometimes be awkward. But you try it out.
I like
try your little game of finding somebody's expertise and finding their passion.
Yeah, utilizing the Lyft or Uber driver, I think, is something that I do not do at all. I am definitely a stare at my phone. Oftentimes, it's the quiet break I have in between 2 crazy events or something. But I really like the idea of utilizing that as an opportunity. You know,
right. And that's fair. If you really do need the quiet time, then take advantage of it. But the fact of the matter is that most of the time you're just using that as an excuse, because in neurological terms, sitting there on your phone staring at social media is not quiet time. It does not rest you.
Not nowadays, it isn't.
No, that is a good point.
Definitely.
So
not.
Very often that's just an excuse not to engage in small talk, and you're not actually getting any rest whatsoever. So, okay, fair enough. You've got a headache. You're overwhelmed. You need some quiet time. Okay, but make it real, actual quiet time.
Okay, so I think this is great. Let's imagine that we're a candidate running for office for the first time, and you have to have many of these conversations, right? You're trying to talk to as many voters, as many donors, as many supporters, volunteers as possible. And you inevitably bump into somebody that disagrees with you philosophically on some issue. Or you just need to move on to the next conversation. How do you bow out of these conversations gracefully if there's a disagreement, or, you know, if you are a little time pressed without offending the other person? Do you have suggestions on graceful bowing outing, if that's a term?
Yes. And actually, this just happened to me, so I can tell you exactly how I did it. So I was just at a conference, and someone started getting into a conversation with me about racism. I'm a mixed race person, and they wanted to talk about how the Confederate flag is not a racist symbol.
Oh, boy.
And so I listened to them. I basically used the same strategy I do on social media, which is like I will do 3 back and forths and then I'm done. So I did three questions to them. They answered them. And I said, you know what? This is a really complicated topic. We're certainly not going to settle it over here. Maybe someday we can meet over a beer and hash this out. The best to you. Thank you so much. And then I moved on.
Yeah, that's solid.
I like it.
Yeah. And you can do some version of that, but I would always suggest that you thank them. You know what? Thank you so much. I know this is an awkward topic. It's difficult to talk about. Thanks for being willing to share your thoughts with me, and then move on.
Yeah. Your book, We Need to Talk, How to Have Conversations That Matter. Does it work for both introverts and extroverts? And if so, how so?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Because like I said, it's like there is a standard for good conversation. And not only that, but a lot of the research that I did included both introverts and extroverts. As it turns out, there's just standards for good conversation, regardless of who you are and your personality. You know, one of the later chapters in the book I think it's called Maybe We Shouldn't Talk.
Mm-hmm.
And in that, I just say, listen, I don't want you to have more conversations necessarily. I just want you to have better ones. And that means that if you are unable to focus on someone else, if you're unable honestly to really listen to someone else, then excuse yourself. And just be honest and say, listen, my brain's in a million different places. I want to hear what you have to say. Let's put a pin in this. Let me get back to you. And then excuse yourself. Because the best thing you can do is when you are in those conversations, really give that person your full attention. And then if you can't, don't waste their time.
Yeah.
I love this. This is really, really great. We have a personal question for you. Considering being a talk show host and an author and a TED Talk host, I imagine you've done a whole slew of people interviewing you, having conversations with you. So what is the most interesting one you've had and why?
Let me think about that.
She's not immediately saying it's us, Jason. We failed. I'm just kidding.
Oh, you mean someone interviewing me?
Yes,
not me
I do.
Interviewing someone else. That's tough because I think the best interviews are always the one where I get a question I haven't been asked. And in your favor, I don't get asked about how to talk about politics among politicians all the time, and it's a subject I love.
Excellent.
But I will say that one of the best interviews I did was with a scientist, because I get all geeked out about the science. And it's really fascinating for me to talk to somebody else who also reads as many studies as I do and actually enjoys them. So, I get wonked out. I can wonk. They say Paul Ryan is the economy wonk or whatever.
Yeah.
I'm the brain science and sociology wonk. Like, I cannot get enough.
I love that.
Very cool. One other little side thing. My partner went to NAU. Were you involved in the school paper at NAU by chance? Northern.
I was not. I was a singer. So I was singing in the performances in the choir.
I forget what it's called. The Lumberjack? Is that what?
The Lumberjack.
Yeah. He worked for the Lumberjack, and I thought, oh God, it'd be such a small world if the two of you had worked together on something at some point.
Yeah,
I didn't know I was going to be a journalist back then.
If folks wanted to read more about your excellent work, where can they find you? Social media, where can they get your book?
Yeah, I mean, you can get the book almost anywhere. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, iBooks, I think it's called, all over the place. And I think the easiest thing to do is if you go to my website, celesteheadlee.com. It has links to all the social media. It has links to follow if you want to buy the book, and it has all 3 of the TED Talks also.
Great. We'll include that in the show notes, too, along with the link to the TED Talk, because it is excellent, and folks should definitely read it, especially if they're interested in having better conversations.
Yeah.
Celeste, thank you so much for taking the time out today. We really appreciate that this was a great conversation and gave folks some really great hands-on advice.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Have a great day.
Celeste.
Wow. Thanks again to Celeste for joining us today. That was a fantastic.
That was so fun.
That was fun. I mean, I don't know that I want to talk to my Uber driver until they've actually worked on having better conversations with me. Let's be honest.
That's fair. I'm always trying to figure out how to get out of conversations with my Lyft driver where I'm just like, I don't want to talk today, but I'm scared to tell them that I don't want to talk today.
Yeah.
I don't know. I think I need to totally work on that a little bit.
I was on a big kick for a while about the worker conditions. And so I was like asking every single Uber and Lyft driver about what's it like to work here? And do you get paid well? And if you are being oppressed, wink, in the rearview mirror.
Do you need help?
Right. I mean, I was like obnoxious about that for a while. And now I'm just sort of like,
don't talk to me.
Yeah. I'm in a coma the minute that I enter the car. But getting back to Celeste. This was a fantastic interview. And, God, that was really great. I think I actually have some tips in my, back pocket that I can use now. I can just,
whip them right out.
Yeah. And, I think the challenge for people in politics is this pressure to have many, many, many conversations, and that pressure to, whether it's voters or donors or lobbyists or whatever it is, probably repels a certain amount of people from being attracted to this business. And so I wonder if there's some sort of self-fulfilling prophecy that happens, that the people who are drawn to this business then tend to be extroverted, and there's not enough balance between introverts and extroverts doing this work. So This was, I think, very helpful advice for those folks.
Well, and I'll tell you that awkward networking event, that first one that I was talking to Celeste about, I got thankfully saved by someone who walked through the door. It turns out I knew them, and then they introduced me to someone else. But the first question out of her mouth was, like, why are you here? What are you doing? And why are you here? And at the time, it was because I was trying to switch careers from radio into politics. And so she did exactly what Celeste suggests, which is get somebody talking about what they're passionate about. So I just started talking about radio and communications and what I wanted to do with it. And then this woman totally ended up, it turns out she gave me a job 6 months later. It was the best meeting that I ever had. But it's as Celeste is giving all of this advice, I'm kind of pinpointing places where that has happened in some networking around my life and realizing that those are some of the best conversations that yielded the highest results. And I didn't even know I was doing that. So elevate that, I think, is what I'm taking away.
So listeners of the podcast, what did you think of this interview? Should we do another follow-up for introverts in politics? If so, what are your thoughts?
Test it out. Let us know if it was helpful.
Yeah, exactly.
I definitely want to read a comment story about that one time I tried the advice I got.
Yeah, exactly.
Did it work?
Yeah, and also subscribe to the podcast. If you're listening on iTunes, pop on over there, subscribe, leave us a review, rate us. We've gotten some great ratings and reviews so far.
Yay.
Oh, P.S. We're in 20 countries right now.
Oh my gosh.
Who's listening to us in South America and in Asia? I have no idea.
They're trying to learn how to run for office or have better conversations.
We're huge in Japan right now, by the way. I have no idea.
Hi, Japan.
Hi, Japan. Thanks
I don't know Japanese.
so
Sorry, I'd say hello, but
I don't either.
Damn.
Oh, well. Maybe we should learn that for the next one,
yes.
since we have a raving fan base over there. And if you have a topic that you think we should be covering on this podcast, then let us know. Send us an email at podcast@electionu.com. On behalf of Election University Podcast, I'm your host, Jason Bennett.
And I'm Rainey Cohen.
Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. This week's episode has ended, but the campaign fun doesn't have to. Head on over to www.electionu.com, where you can access all of the links mentioned in today's episode, as well as the show notes. There you can also sign up for regular announcements or register for our campaign school. It's your very own online personal trainer for winning campaigns. www.electionu.com. Click, learn, win.